welcome to episode 4 of Unlocking the Vault with your host, Dan Linstedt. My name's Cindi Meyersohn. We're happy to be back with you. And we're going to pick up from episode 3, where we left off starting to talk about an important topic around a risk and mitigation strategy that the business needs to consider for mergers and acquisitions. But not only mergers and acquisitions, oftentimes they'll forget about divestitures. What do you do with your data, and what are your risks around data for divestiture? So, Dan, if we can go back and just sort of touch back on some of the capabilities around like risk and mitigation strategies for mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures, and if you could share some of your, past experiences in these areas, that would be great.
Thanks, Cindy. I got 2 stories for everybody today, and I'll try to keep them relatively short because we've got a whole lot of good content to get through. So thanks, everybody, for joining us again. Appreciate it. I'm Dan Linstedt, in case you couldn't tell. Mergers and acquisitions, they're a funny business, and I mean that in all senses of the word. They're difficult for IT, but they're also difficult for business. When I say mergers and acquisitions, one of the things a lot of people forget to think about is divestitures. What happens when a company splits, much less a government. Let's say a government signs an agreement with another country to share naval replenishment or Air Force replenishment. In other words, they fly a jet into a local air base that they're friends with for that year, and they have to have all the parts in stock and different things like that. So, then the next year they don't re-sign the treaty, don't re-sign the agreement. What happens to all that data, and how do you deal with that? It's not so much a PII as it is a country ownership issue. Well, I've got one of the stories today around this. There's a ton of risk in acquiring data. And before I get into the story, I just want to say this as well. Something else to think about in mergers and acquisitions, there's a whole process called due diligence, which usually has to happen before the final, sign on the dotted line, we bought your company, in terms of a merger. And when you ingest all of the company's data and you try to analyze it from an analytics perspective, what does it mean? How do you merge that data in with your current operations? How do you get it in a timely fashion? And usually timely means less than 24 hours or 3 days or 5 days, because you might have 2 weeks capable of doing due diligence. You might have 2 months, but there certainly is a fixed timeline that's driven by the business. Whenever you do a merger or an acquisition of another company, during the due diligence phase, they set these timelines in legal and in business for what's appropriate for you to go sniffing around in their data sets. So all these things need to be considered. But the stories I'm going to share with you today are not a merger, but they're mergers of data. And they're not necessarily acquisitions of companies, but rather a couple of government agencies. So the first is the CIO of the Swedish government. So the Swedish government every year, and I heard this firsthand from the Swedish government years ago. Every year they sign treaties with different countries who are friendly to them to service their naval and aircraft and all those other things at different bases. When they sign these treaties, they're allowed to fly planes in and refuel them and stock them for parts and maintain them on base and all of that. So they're allowed to use the bases. They're allowed to use foreign land and foreign workers, and everybody's sort of under the same umbrella, but they share parts, and they have to share intelligence and analytics around the data sets for what are qualified parts for these replacements for the ships and for the aircraft and so on. So this is important. And so how do you know a certain base in a friendly country has enough information to service an aircraft when you need to service it? How do you know? This is where the mergers and acquisitions come in. So the data vault allows you to pair this information together by business key, because we're focused on the business ontology, and bring that together and actually be able to tell, hey, they have these parts, they don't have those parts, all the keys line up, or these keys are mapped to those keys. And so these are all some of the things that they were able to do. And the CIO actually walked up to me and said, thank you for the data vault. And I said, why? And he told me this story. And then he said, well, because we were able to merge and acquire, we can, in about 24 to 48 hours after signing a treaty with another country, we can ingest and model and absorb their data set due to the repeatable patterns and the scalable patterns and how we do it. And then we can leverage it using analytics and so on. And then at the end of the year, if the country doesn't re-sign the treaty, then they can divest that data. They can just as easily cut it off and leave the data vault in place for what they built with the country, and they keep their own data in their own system and all of that. So this is one of the things the data vault was built to do. It was architected to do that for Department of Defense. Now, the other story I'm going to share with you is the Netherlands Tax Authority wanted to share data with the Netherlands Bureau of Statistics. In the Netherlands, it's called, the Dutch Tax Authority is called Belastingdienst, in case you've seen it. And the Netherlands Bureau of Statistics is actually called CBS, Central Bureau of Statistics. And they wanted to share data almost on a nightly basis about their people and everything else. So the Bureau of Stats collects householding information and all kinds of things. And the tax authority wants to value householding and where people move and all of that. So they have different purposes and different focuses, where the Bureau of Stats would send people out into the field and talk to people in the household and discover data about these people. And so the address of where these people are and who these people are important. And so what we did was we designed a data vault in both places, in the tax authority first, and then we designed another data vault in the Bureau of Stats. And what we did was we cordoned off another set of data. Based on the data vault's design, we can actually take a chunk of data in a managed set of ways and simply back it up and dump it, and then share that data set in its raw format and simply remount it on the other side. So this was cross-sharing of information that was managed and governed between the CBS and the Netherlands Tax Authority. They would share both directions, and so they would enrich each other's data set on a daily basis. What this says is this is cheaper to do things up front. This is all architected and all designed at the enterprise level to work this way. And so you spend a little bit of time working on mitigating this risk of acquiring and divesting data, which is what we started with, by choosing the right architecture, by choosing the right design approach, by choosing a methodology with repeatable standards and good governance. And of course, you can't have good governance without the people involved either. So I don't want to leave the people out of this. You can have the best governance methodology in the world, but without the people, it doesn't happen, right? So the people have to be on board. But this helps you mitigate this risk of acquiring and divesting data. And a lot of the problem here is many of the warehousing environments and the C-levels and directors, they know there's a risk, but they don't know what they can do about it until it's too late. So they don't invest up front because they really don't know what they're investing in. So where are they going to put their money? And IT doesn't have a strategy to be successful in those lines. They're just simply handed all this data from a new company when a mergers and acquisition is signed. Here's all this data, figure out how to integrate it. And there's no strategy, there's no plan, there's no consistency, there's no repeatability. So all of these things need to play to work together. Now, if you take a look at another hot topic today, data mesh says a lot of good things about enterprise architecture and the need to do some upfront work at the enterprise level. Doesn't mean you need enterprise governance at an enterprise level, and doesn't mean you sit in an ivory tower. And by no means does it mean that you get caught in analysis paralysis. That's the last place you want to be. So you do some enterprise governance, you guide, lead, build, and iterate. But the data mesh actually brings this concept to bear and says, hey, look, you need distributed governance, but you need enterprise management. You need to understand what teams are doing what data is going where, and who the product owners are, and all of this needs to be distributed, and so that you can get an enterprise scale. The data vault works with that as well.
It seems as though this still ties back to digital transformation and modernization efforts to strategy, right? Picking a strategy, a methodology that can carry you forward. Everything you're talking about with mergers and acquisitions and even divestitures, if you touch on that, this idea that you're laying a foundation. If I could just digress for a moment, one of my favorite stories is a story that has to do with postmodernism and this whole idea that that things don't matter, if you will, that nothing really has a purpose. And I think sometimes as we've moved forward in technology, we think, we don't need no stinking models anymore. We don't need no stinking planet anymore, right? We have all these tools, and the tools are our silver bullets. It's that, that pushing that magic button. And I think that our industry has misled business in a number of ways and done a great disservice to business in, I want to call it, the facade of tools answering everyone's questions. But there's a story of a gentleman that went to do a lecture on postmodernism at the Ohio State University, and they have one of the first postmodern arts centers that was ever built. And the interesting thing about it is they were sort of bragging about their postmodern businesses. They were bragging about, well, we have stairwells that go nowhere and doors that open into the ceilings and all this kind of thing. And so they were talking about this as if this building were some kind of architectural wonder. And the gentleman that they were having this conversation with, who was taking it as sort of an opposing argument in this upcoming debate on postmodernism, said to them, well, tell me something. Did they build the foundation that way? And the funny part of it is, no, if your foundation is not built with, I would say, true engineering, it will fall apart. And even this facade they built on top of it still had a foundation, because those principles of physics, and in this case, engineering, architectural engineering, stand true. These issues around strategy and this need to truly engineer and architect up front, which you've touched on, even with data mesh, you still need a methodology. Anyway, I just love that story because it brings home a lot of things that we would like to believe aren't required. And we always go back in Data Vault to say, you have to have a foundation that you can build upon. Similar to that, if you think about strategy, we also often hear a lot about, well, the business goes around us, and why does that happen? So we have an approach, right? Managed self-service BI. Can you talk to that, to the business? Like, what is the difference between this term self-service BI that we hear everywhere and the Data Vault's, I would say, approach to what we call managed self-service BI? What's the history? What's the importance of those things?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic for sure. We all hear about self-service BI. We've heard about it since the dawn of, analytics. Put more power in the hands of business users. In a nutshell, or as a concept, that's a great idea. But I would add to that statement, in the hands of business users who are allowed to have it, the ones that are authorized to see what they need to see when they need to see it. When you talk about it that way, the first thing you realize is self-service BI, this whole idea of, well, here's all the raw data sitting in a data dump is what I'm going to call it, or data junkyard is another term I like to use. And you just say, have at it. You really open the Pandora's box to your raw data. The good, the bad, and the ugly all of a sudden come out, and the dragon rears its ugly head. And yeah, they have access to everything whenever they want it, but how good of an answer can they really create if they don't understand the metadata around it, if they don't understand the purpose of the data set that's sitting there? If you've got 100 columns labeled A1 through CZ, and they're all numbers, what do those numbers mean? And can you use them? Oh, well, this, A15 looks like a column that I've seen before, and I'm going to attach it to this data set, and then I'm going to base business decisions on it. Well, that doesn't sound very good, and it isn't. It's really self-service BI is the Pandora's box for analytics if you treat it that way. What you really, really want, or should be striving for at an enterprise level, is something we like to call managed self-service BI. Now, there's nothing wrong with the term self-service BI in a nutshell. At a conceptual level, I get it. Put more power in the hands of business users who deserve to have it or are allowed to have it. But if you say allowed to have it, you're implying governance, right? So when I imply governance, what does that mean? I imply some form of management. This is where we start with the term managed self-service BI, is a good form of governance. Yes, allow the users access to the right data at the right time. That's the right way to do it. Also, give the users access to those who have privileges. You and I both come from government environments, DoD, NSA, DoD stands for Department of Defense. national security agencies for. But in those environments, God help you if you just simply release raw data to whomever has access to a login. You could be stuck in federal prison for that. So hopefully your jobs out there, your listeners, our listeners out there aren't in such dire consequences. But I can tell you, managed self-service BI is exactly what the doctor ordered. And this brings to mind an analogy. You don't want to walk into a pharmacy and then choose your own prescription drug to treat your own heart condition that you think you have. You want to see an expert, and then you want that expert to prescribe a certain thing, and then you want to go in and you trust the expert to guide you in the right direction, and you trust the pharmacist to build the right pill or the right mix of the right pills, so you don't take one pill and just die, right? That's managed self-service BI. Yet there's a number of things that are approved in the same pharmacy for over the counter. In other words, stuff you can do. If you've got heartburn, you can select from a myriad of products that are pre-designed, pre-built, pre-quality checked, that you can go buy at the counter and take home. So this is the same concept in analytics. We want to manage or mitigate the risk of, quote, true self-service BI, the Pandora's box, and we want to land in the middle. We don't want to over-govern, and we don't want to over-control, and we certainly don't want IT standing in the way of any of this, because, of course, if IT stands in the way, we all know what happens. Business users will start to say things like, well, we built our own because IT cost too much, and we built our own because IT took too long, and we built our own because we can do it better. Well, take your pick. They go out there, they load Excel, they load Access databases, or they start shadow organizations, all because IT can't perform or doesn't look like it's performing to the speed of the business. So this is what we mean by managed self-service BI. With a bit of management, IT can basically curate the data, at least from a perspective of categorization, organization, control, and PII masking, and all those other wonderful things, and enable the business user, then turn it over in a state that enables the business user to get their own access to it. And that's the power of the tools, where you get Power BI, or you get Tableau, or you get ClickView, or something else on top of one of these solutions, where they really can move around and play with it. What that means is that IT is no longer responsible for delivering the final end result reports. We want that in the hands of the business users, where it should be. But IT should be in the business of not only managing, but helping define the metadata and the data sets, the categorization. We use a term called taxonomy and ontology quite a bit to speak to the business, to help control this management effort and to reduce the risk. If we can define management or taxonomy and ontologies from a governance perspective at an enterprise level, and then use that to guide our principles for our design of our enterprise data warehouse, which in this case would be a data vault organized by business keys, right? It all flows all the way through, all the way to the output stages and the definition and data sharing that we want to do with the business users, or the enablement of the business users. I want to talk about this for just a minute, what it means to a data mesh approach. When you talk about data mesh isn't a methodology. Data mesh doesn't tell you how to build it. It doesn't give you the prescriptive design, do this, do this, do this, do that, and you will achieve success. Data mesh talks about concepts. Data mesh is great at the high level concepts it defines. It's great for a lot of the things that it closes the knowledge gap on. When it comes time to build, however, you have to have a methodology underneath that. Data mesh is an approach. You've got to put a managed self-service BI, which has to work in conjunction with the data mesh approach at the enterprise level and the enterprise data warehousing at the implementation level. You've got to have these two things working in concert. And that's where the governance procedures start to work. And of course, with the methodology, you need something that's prescriptive, that will tell you, here are the guardrails around what you want to build and why. So it brings with it good governance. It brings with it an agile way of working. So in the data vault landscape, we partner up with Scott Ambler and Mark Lyons, who developed Discipline Agile Delivery. And we work that into the data vault methodology that helps you deliver in an agile fashion. But we pile on to that implementation guidelines and best practices that allows you to do things like separate your concerns. I've got a concern of a data lake. Yep, we got to deal with that. Cool. I've got a concern of staging data. Do I really stage data? Do I need to stage data if I've got a data lake? Well, for some data, maybe. For other data, no. How do I do deltas? How do I move data into the business? How do I organize data so that the business understands it? And that's where we get, an unambiguous ontology and or taxonomy and a set of business terms that have to map to the metadata or the physical descriptions that live in the table structures. Because after all, what do the BI tools use? The BI tools, first they hit the table structures, right? So somebody in the BI tool landscape has to understand what's available in the database and how do I get at it and what does it mean? And then sometimes there's a layer of translation between that and the business users or the analysts themselves. And other times there isn't. Other times the business analysts themselves are truly managed self-service and they plug into the metadata and go hunting for the information that they need. This also works exactly the same way for data scientists. The methodology has to be able to prep and curate the data so that data scientists can pick it up and simply do what they do best. Build AI models and ML models and learn what's there and do predictive analysis and everything else. And I once heard, in fact, I think I heard this from you, Cindi, if you hire a data scientist and they end up working to source data or acquire data into a stage or a data lake, that's the most expensive ETL developer you've ever hired. And we don't want them doing that. So you need a methodology for your enterprise warehouse to cover that aspect. And that's one of the things that the Data Vault will bring to the table for you.
As a CTO or a CIO or even a CFO who's looking at funding, and obviously finance data is critical. When we talk about managed self-service BI, how would you word that with regard to their approach for understanding IT's need for a strategy and a methodology? Can you put it in terms of how the business might actually see the results of managed self-service BI and the results of a strategy related to a data modernization or a digital transformation effort related to these things?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I've got a corporate jet rental company, an example of a real life story from this company that I helped go this direction. So there is something to it. Managed self-service BI isn't just ontologies and good governance. That's the end result. That's part of the end result that you see. But you have to have IT working in lockstep or in concert. And IT has to get better, as we all know, at delivery times and delivery performance and higher quality. The last thing you want is IT to deliver something to production and then have to rework it because they made some serious mistakes or egregious mistakes in the design of the architecture, or something doesn't work because it doesn't scale. Rework in production from IT in a data warehouse is notoriously costly. And as we talked about in the last podcast, it leads to greenfielding, which is shut down and restart. We don't want those situations. I walked into this corporate jet rental company and they were having trouble delivering, and they didn't really have managed self-service BI. The business analysts were frustrated. They were frustrated with IT. IT was pointing the finger. Hey, look, you gave us all this work to do. We can't deliver because we're missing requirements. So they were all pointing fingers at each other. I said, well, first off, the finger pointing has to stop. And that's a given. Everybody knows that. Second thing is we had to look at the business user and see what they were really complaining about. And when we took a look at the business user said, well, we talked to this one specific long-standing poll or problem and talked to this one business user that owned that. And we said, what do you do at the end of every week? What do you do to assemble your report? And he pulled up an Excel spreadsheet similar to what all of you do out there, I'm sure. And he said, first I go over here and I grab this data, and he pulled up some other arcane data source and he copied data into Excel, just literally copy paste. And then he says, well, I have to go to the next tab. So he went to the next tab in Excel. And then he says, now I have to run this query and wait for it to return. So he logged into some Access database and ran a query and got some more data. This took him 4 hours to demonstrate this to us. 4 hours for one set of results that were week ending. And he went across 7 or 8 different data sources. Some of them operational, some of them were aggregated, some of them, he had no clue the last time they were even updated. there was a lot of missing pieces. I said to IT, well, where is this data? And they started talking about the complex business rules in Excel that this user had. And I said, you guys are focusing on the wrong thing. Complex business rules in Excel should stay there for now. And this is where a lot of listeners will hear a sigh of relief for now, right? Eventually they should be in a governed tool like Tableau or whatever. But from that perspective, let's not focus on replacing those business rules. How do we get our sprint down so that this business user can have a managed set of data that is delivered consistently on time every time he wants to pull it, and his queries will take less than a second or two to get, because he wasn't pulling more than 20,000 rows at any given time. So it was, he didn't have huge volumes to deal with in terms of Excel. So that would have been a whole nother ball of wax, but we didn't have to unravel that one there. We took a 4-hour process and basically we turned it into a 20-second process or less. And we did that by not only collaborating with the business user and understanding the base problem, but going back and saying what needs to be managed about this data delivery. That's the key question. And what we discovered was if we deliver the raw data in one place from one source, and we give him, or even 4 different tables that are all accessible by one login, in the format he's used to pulling. So the cut, copy, paste goes away, the manual effort goes away, then he can do that. And what we did was we ended up creating one query. We built this system on Data Vault, and we ingested these 4, 5, 6, 7 sources. I forget what they were now. And we did this in the course of 7 days while I was there. So I was there for 2 weeks, worked through the team, taught them how to do an iterative sprint approach to solving a single business user's problem. They got really good at this pattern-based management and enabling the business user for self-service BI. That's the punchline here, which I'll finish with in just a second. But in terms of this story, so we sourced all this data, we ran it through a repeatable set of processes, a consistent design, and through the Data Vault and on out into information marts. And the information mart then was mostly raw data. It was pre-aggregated. This was one of the keys. Because as soon as he got this answer set, he said, well, this isn't the only report I have to go do this with. I have this one, this one, this one, and that one that you guys don't even know about that I run right as soon as I get this one done, I go over here. And it's some of the same data in these reports. I said, great, we'll hit multiple birds with one stone. So we got the data to the right level of granularity to answer 5 or 6 of these Excel spreadsheet reports. We left the logic in Excel as a starting point, said, you know what, that's out of scope. We'll provide you the data for the logic. You run the logic. And when you're comfortable with it, then you can transition the next piece over into a BI tool where it makes a little more sense. So this is how managed self-service BI works. It's an agile, collaborative effort between you and the business in defining metadata and providing data in a consistent, repeatable time frame. And after 2 weeks, we got it done inside of 7 days, 7 working days, and that we used the last day, I think it was, or the last 2 days, to make sure that the data he was getting was good. And we took his 4-hour process down to about, as I said before, 2 to 5 seconds. And he thanked us. And then he pulled up the other reports and he started sourcing the data right out of there for the other reports. That's self-service. That's the managed self-service part. And he started reducing the time on all those reports. As soon as the other business analysts, and this is the final punchline on this, as soon as the other business analysts caught wind, we had solved his problem. And he was the loudest naysayer in the company at the time. As soon as he was happy, all of a sudden, the other business analyst opened up and said, hey, can you do the same for us? And now IT wasn't seen as a bottleneck anymore. IT was seen as solving problems. And this team that I taught the agile method started out with 7 days. And then over the course of 3 months, they got better and better and better. And they were delivering in 2-day iteration cycles the same amount of work that they were delivering when they were learning the process in over 7 days. So we want to reduce the barriers to working collaboratively with the business, but managed self-service BI is definitely a big part of that. So it's governance over how the things are built, which is the prescriptive methodology, and it's governance over who has access to the right data at the right time. So they have to work together.
I love this idea of providing a prescriptive methodology for managed self-service BI. You've often said, if it's not managed, it's not governed, right? I always look at a data vault as an entire solution, right? It's like a complement of governance with this agile way of working to build out a foundation that is resilient to change and resilient to scale. I'd like to continue this conversation. I have a couple of things, and maybe in a future podcast, I'd love to add on to this idea of self-service for data science and how that really, really should work. And I did say that, yeah, data scientists, most expensive ETL developer you will ever hire. So let's use those guys the right way. Going into episode 5, because I know we're out of time today, what I'd like to do is talk about, what happens when or how should the business really consider governance procedures. You've talked before about things like, data and funding and process and quality and metadata. I would love to be able to go back to episode 1 and start defining those kinds of terms as we go forward. For the business to understand, when we say metadata, what does that really mean to them? And when we talk about data quality and things like that, what does that really mean to them? And governance, what does that really mean? Because I've had some very interesting experiences in my career with, what is governance? Where does governance belong? Where does IT belong in the governance process and things like that? So do you want to add anything maybe quickly to where we're going to go in episode 5 with regard to what business should consider so people know what to look for?
Well, I do. We're going to talk more about governance. We'll dig a little bit deeper, not too deep. We'll stick with the business and the business terminology, but we will continue to define terms as we go through. As we mentioned in episode 1, terminology and accurate or concise definitions is one of the most important things to not only good governance, but successful implementations of enterprise analytics solutions around the world.
Thank you, Dan. So we appreciate everybody's time. I'll let Dan close out. I just want to say thank you. And we will be back in episode 5. Dan?
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.